1789 to 1797. Number 1. President George Washington. First spouse Martha Washington. Vice President John Adams. 1797 to 1801. President John Adams. First spouse Abigail Adams. Vice President Thomas Jefferson. 1801 to 1805. Number 3. President Thomas Jefferson. First spouse Martha Wayles Skelton Jefferson. Vice President Aaron Burr. 1805 to 1809. President Thomas Jefferson. First spouse Martha Wayles Skelton Jefferson. Vice President George Clinton. 1809 to 1812. President James Madison. First spouse Dolley Madison. Vice President George Clinton. 1812 to 1813. President James Madison. First spouse Dolley Madison. Vice President, office vacant. 1813 to 1814. President James Madison. First spouse Dolley Madison. Vice President Elbridge Gerry. 1812 to 1813. President James Madison. First spouse Dolley Madison. Vice President, office vacant. 1817 to 1825. President James Monroe. First spouse Elizabeth Cartwright Monroe. Vice President Daniel D. Tompkins. 1825 to 1829. President John Quincy Adams. First spouse Louisa Catherine Adams. Vice President John C. Calhoun. 1829 to 1832. Andrew Jackson. First spouse Rachel Jackson II. Vice President John C. Calhoun. 1829 to 1832. Andrew Jackson. First spouse Rachel Jackson II. Vice President John C. Calhoun. 1833 to 1837. President Andrew Jackson. First spouse Rachel Jackson. Vice President Martin Van Buren. 1837 to 1841. President Martin Van Buren. First spouse Hannah Hose Van Buren. Vice President Richard M. Johnson. 1841. President William Henry Harrison. First spouse Anna Tuthill Sims Harrison. Vice President John Tyler. 1841 to 1845. President John Tyler. First spouse Letitia Christian Tyler and Julia Gardner Tyler. Vice President, office vacant. 1845 to 1849. President. First spouse James K. Polk. Vice President Sarah Childress Polk. George M. Dallas.
1849-1850. President Zachary Taylor or first spouse or Margaret Mackle Smith Taylor or Vice President or Millard Fillmore.
1850-1853. President Millard Fillmore. First spouse Abigail Powers Fillmore or Vice President, office vacant. 1853. President Franklin Pierce. First spouse Jane M. Pierce of Vice President William R. King. 1853-1857. President Franklin Pierce. First spouse Jane M. Pierce. Vice President, office vacant. 1857 to 1861. President James Buchanan. Never married. Vice President John C. Breckinridge.
1861-1865. President Abraham Lincoln or first spouse Mary Todd Lincoln or Vice President or Hannibal Hamlin.
1865. President Abraham Lincoln. First spouse Mary Todd Lincoln. Vice President Andrew Johnson.
1865-1869. President Andrew Johnson. First spouse or Eliza McArdle Johnson or Vice President or office vacant. 1869-1873. President Ulysses S. Grant or first spouse or Julia Dett Grant. Vice President or Schuyler Colfax. 1875-1877. President or Ulysses S. Grant or first spouse or Julia Dett Grant or Vice President or office vacant.
1877-1881. President Rutherford B. Hayes. First spouse Lucy Webb Hayes. Vice President, William A. Wheeler. 1881. President, James A. Garfield. First spouse, Lucretia Rudolph Garfield. Vice President, Chester A. Arthur. 1881-1885. President, Chester A. Arthur. First spouse, Ellen Herndon Arthur, a Vice President. Office vacant.
1885 President Grover Cleveland or first spouse, or Francis Folsom Cleveland or Vice President, or Thomas A. Hendricks.
1885-1889. President Grover Cleveland. First spouse, Francis Folsom Cleveland. Vice President. Office vacant.
1889-1893. President Benjamin Harrison. First spouse Carolyn Lavinia Scott Harrison and Mary Lord Harrison. Vice President Levy P. Morton.
1893-1897. President Grover Cleveland. First spouse Francis Folsom Cleveland. Vice President Adlai E. Stevenson. 1897-1899. President William McKinley. First spouse Ida Saxton McKinley, our Vice President Garrett A. Hobart. 1899-1901. William McKinley. Ida Saxton McKinley, Vice President. Office vacant. 1901. President William McKinley. Ida Saxton McKinley. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt. 1901-1905. President Theodore Roosevelt. First spouse Edith Kermit Caro Roosevelt, a Vice President, or office vacant. 1905-1909. President Theodore Roosevelt. First spouse Edith Kermit Caro Roosevelt. Vice President Charles W. Fairbanks. 1909-1912. President William H. Taft. First spouse Helen Harron Taft. Vice President James S. Sherman. 1909-1912. President William H. Taft. First spouse Helen Harron Taft. Vice President James S. Sherman. 1913-1921. President Woodrow Wilson. First spouse Ellen Axum Wilson and Edith Bowling-Galt Wilson. Vice President Thomas R. Marshall.
19-119-3. President Warren G. Harding or first spouse Florence Kling Harding or Vice President, or Calvin Coolidge.
1923-1925. President Calvin Coolidge. First spouse Grace Goodhue Coolidge. Vice President. Office vacant. 1923-1925. President Calvin Coolidge. First spouse Grace Goodhue Coolidge. Vice President Charles G. Dawes. 1929-1933. President Herbert Hoover. First spouse Olu Henry Hoover E. Vice President Charles Curtis. 1933-1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. First spouse Eleanor Roosevelt. Vice President John N. Garner. 1933-1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. First spouse Eleanor Roosevelt. Vice President Henry A. Wallace. 1933-1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. First spouse Eleanor Roosevelt. Vice President Harry S. Truman. 1945-1949. President Harry S. Truman. First spouse Bess Wallace Truman. Vice President. Office vacant. 1945-1949. President Harry S. Truman. First spouse Bess Wallace Truman. Vice President Alban W. Barkley. 1953-1961. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. First spouse Mamie Dowd Eisenhower. Vice President Richard M. Nixon. 1961 to 1963, President John F. Kennedy. First spouse Jacqueline Kennedy. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. 1963 to 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson. First spouse Lady Burr Johnson. Vice President. Office vacant. 1963 to 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson. First spouse Lady Burr Johnson. Vice President. Hubert Humphrey. 1969 to 1973, President Richard M. Nixon. First spouse Pat Nixon. Vice President. 1974–1977, President Gerald R. Ford. First spouse Betty Ford. Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. 1977–1981, President Jimmy Carter. First spouse or Rosalind Carter. Vice President Walter F. Mondale. 1981–1989, President Ronald Reagan. First spouse or Nancy Reagan. Vice Presidents George H.W. Bush. 1989–1993, Presidents George H.W. Bush. First spouse Barbara Bush. Vice Presidents Dan Quayle. 1993–2001, Presidents Bill Clinton. First spouse Hillary Rodham Clinton. Vice Presidents Albert Gore. 2001–2009, President George W. Bush. First spouse Laura Bush. Vice Presidents Richard Cheney. 2009–2017, Presidents Barack Obama. First spouse Michelle Obama. Vice Presidents Joseph R. Biden. 2017–2021, Presidents Donald J. Trump. First spouse Melania Trump. Vice Presidents Mike Pence. 2021–2024, Presidents Joseph R. Biden. First spouse Jill Biden. Vice Presidents Kamala Harris.